On February 24, 2022, Vladimir Putin announced what he called a special military operation in Ukraine. And then he said something that he had said versions of before, but never quite so directly, never quite in this context. The word nuclear was not used. It didn't need to be. Every leader in the world, every foreign ministry, every defense analyst understood exactly what was being said. And then, over the following months, something extraordinary happened. Not extraordinary in the sense of surprising, in the sense of revealing. The response of the Western alliance to that threat exposed something fundamental about the machine we examined in Part 1. The world called the Bluff, and in doing so, the world ran an experiment on mutually assured destruction. A live experiment, in real time, with real consequences. The results were illuminating, and not entirely reassuring. Let us be precise about what Putin was threatening, because precision matters here. Russia possesses the world's largest nuclear arsenal by total warhead count. Approximately 6,000 warheads in total inventory, with roughly 1,550 currently deployed on strategic delivery systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and strategic bombers. Putin's nuclear threats were not empty in the sense of being physically impossible. The capability is real. The weapons exist. The delivery systems are operational and regularly exercised. The question was never whether the weapons existed. The question was whether the threat to use them was rational. And this is where the paradox lives, and where the Ukraine war became one of the most significant stress tests of nuclear deterrence theory since the Cuban Missile Crisis. A nuclear threat is only credible if the threatened party believes the threatening party is willing to accept the consequences of nuclear use. And the consequences for Russia of nuclear use against Ukraine or any NATO member are these. NATO possesses, between the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, sufficient nuclear weapons to eliminate Russia as a functioning civilization. The United States alone has approximately 1,770 deployed strategic warheads, on submarines that Putin cannot locate, on land-based missiles in hardened silos, on bombers that can be airborne within minutes of a launch warning. The British Vanguard-class submarines operate independently and would also retaliate. The French Force de Frappe adds a third independent nuclear retaliatory capability. If Russia uses nuclear weapons against Ukraine, a non-NATO state, the response is uncertain but severe. If Russia uses them against any NATO member, certain devastation. Not a diplomatic rebuke, not sanctions. The physical destruction of Russia as a functioning civilization. So the question Putin's threat actually poses is this. Is Vladimir Putin willing to end Russia in order to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO? The West calculated, no, he is not. And this calculation, that the threat was either a rational bluff or a sign of genuine irrationality, both of which pointed toward the same response, fundamentally shaped everything that followed. What makes the Ukraine war uniquely valuable as a case study is the timeline. We can trace, almost week by week, how the nuclear threat interacted with Western decision-making, and the pattern that emerges is not the one Putin intended. February 24, 2022. Invasion begins. Putin invokes nuclear consequences. Western response. Impose sanctions. Provide defensive weapons. Stingers, javelins. March 2022. Putin places nuclear forces on special combat readiness. Western response. Continue weapon shipments. April 2022. Kyiv suburbs retaken. Bucha atrocities documented. Western response. Heavier weapons announced. Howitzers, armored vehicles. June 2022. HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems announced for Ukraine. Russia threatens consequences. Western response. Delivery proceeds.
Those who try to blackmail us with nuclear weapons should know that the weather vane can turn and point towards them.
This was the moment the stakes were highest. Partial mobilization meant Russia was no longer pretending this was a limited operation. The nuclear language was the most direct it had been. And the Western response, after a pause, after intense diplomatic back-channel communication, was to continue. October 2022. Abrams tanks begin their long approval process. F-16s begin their longer approval process. The weapons pipeline keeps moving. The pattern is unmistakable. And the pattern is this: the threat did not deter. It delayed. It created political pressure on Western governments who were genuinely uncertain about escalation risks. But delay is not deterrence. Every weapon that was eventually delivered after a nuclear threat demonstrated, in retrospect, that the threat had failed. Nuclear weapons, deployed as political pressure rather than military capability, function like a currency that inflates when overused. Each threat that went unexecuted reduced the credibility of the next threat. By late 2023, the debate in Western capitals had shifted from "Will Russia use nuclear weapons?" to "How do we manage Russia's face-saving exit from a war it is losing?" That is a complete reversal of the deterrence dynamic Putin intended to create. There is one dimension of the Ukraine war's nuclear risk that does not fit neatly into the MAD framework, because it was not about warheads, it was about reactors. In March 2022, Russian forces seized the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. For the next 18 months, the plant became the site of an extraordinary and genuinely terrifying standoff. Russian forces used the plant as a military base, storing ammunition near reactor buildings, firing artillery from positions on the plant's grounds. Ukrainian forces shelled the surrounding area in attempts to dislodge them. Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, described the situation repeatedly as without precedent. He visited the plant multiple times. His reports used language that diplomats almost never use, language of genuine alarm. This was a different kind of nuclear threat. Not a warhead, not a launch, but a radiological catastrophe that could have rendered large portions of Ukraine, and depending on wind patterns, parts of Eastern Europe, uninhabitable for decades. A Chernobyl-scale disaster, or worse, since Zaporizhzhia has 6 reactors to Chernobyl's 1, would have produced outcomes comparable in some respects to a tactical nuclear strike, without Russia ever pressing a launch button. Whether this was deliberate Russian strategy, creating nuclear risk through conventional means, avoiding the threshold that would trigger NATO's explicit nuclear response, or simply reckless disregard for safety protocols in a military operation is unclear. It may be both simultaneously. What Zaporizhzhia demonstrated is that nuclear risk in the modern era is not limited to warheads on missiles. It includes the 440 civilian nuclear reactors currently operating worldwide, in countries that are increasingly subjects of great power competition. The vulnerability is not hypothetical, it is structural. On October 6, 2022, 2 weeks after Putin's partial mobilization speech, President Biden said something at a Democratic fundraiser in New York that the White House had not scripted. President Biden warned of, quote, "the prospect of Armageddon," a comparison to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The White House spent the next 48 hours walking this back. Officials insisted Biden was simply reiterating long-standing policy, that there was no new intelligence, that the president was speaking in broad terms. He was not speaking in broad terms. The New York Times later reported that in the fall of 2022, the administration had received intelligence suggesting Putin was actively discussing tactical nuclear use with senior Russian military officials. The intelligence was serious enough that Biden convened senior national security officials to model American responses to various scenarios of Russian nuclear use in Ukraine. What those scenarios revealed was this: there was no good option. A nuclear strike on Ukraine that did not hit NATO territory presented a genuine threshold problem. NATO's Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, applies to NATO members. Ukraine was not a NATO member. A Russian tactical nuclear strike on Kiev would kill tens or hundreds of thousands of people. It would be an atrocity without precedent since 1945, and it would not automatically trigger Article 5. The American-modeled responses ranged from devastating conventional retaliation, destroying the Russian forces in Ukraine and the Black Sea Fleet, to nuclear response of some form. None of them were clean. None of them left the world better than it had been before the strike. This is the part of the nuclear conversation that never makes it into the deterrence textbooks cleanly. The theory of MAD assumes binary clarity. You use nuclear weapons, we use nuclear weapons, mutual destruction. The actual scenario the Biden administration was working through in October 2022 was murkier than that. A tactical strike on a non-NATO country, a threshold question, a decision tree with no good exits. Biden's Armageddon comment was not a gaffe. It was a man telling the public, in the only language available to him at a fundraiser, that the thing he was being briefed on in the Situation Room was genuinely terrifying, and that the elegant logic of mutually assured destruction, the beautiful trap of Part 1, gets considerably less elegant when you introduce tactical weapons, non-NATO targets, and the ambiguity of thresholds. There is one more frame I want to address before we close this episode, because it has dominated the political debate about Ukraine, and because it contains a fundamental structural error. The argument runs, Ukraine is Poland 1939. Russia is Germany. The West's reluctance to engage is appeasement. Appeasement failed then. It will fail now. The only answer is overwhelming support for Ukraine, regardless of Russian nuclear threats. This argument has been made by serious people. It has driven real policy. It is not wrong about everything, but it contains a structural gap that matters enormously. And the gap is this. World War II ended. It ended with occupation. Germany was occupied. Japan was occupied. The defeated powers were governed, rebuilt, reformed, and eventually invited back into the community of nations. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe. The American occupation of Japan produced a constitutional democracy. The post-war reconstruction was not inevitable. It required enormous effort and resources. But it was possible because the defeated powers still existed. The infrastructure was damaged but repairable. The populations were traumatized but present. The agricultural land could still grow food. Nuclear war produces none of these conditions. A nuclear exchange between Russia and NATO would not produce a defeated Russia available for occupation and reconstruction. It would produce a radiological catastrophe on a continental scale. There is no Marshall Plan for a country whose cities are craters and whose topsoil cannot be farmed for decades. There is no denazification process for a leadership whose population is dead. The WW3 parallel is politically powerful because it is historically accurate about the failure of appeasement, but it is strategically incomplete because it assumes the end state of military conflict is a defeated but survivable adversary. In a nuclear exchange, the end state is not defeat. It is extinction. The bomb doesn't just end the war, it ends the post-war. Here is what the Ukraine war taught us about mutually assured destruction. The machine held. Russia did not use nuclear weapons. The West's escalation calculus, that Putin was bluffing, proved correct. Ukraine received weapons that, 6 months earlier, Western governments had been afraid to provide. The nuclear threat inflated with each use and deflated with each non-execution. But the machine held imperfectly. There were moments. The partial mobilization, the Zaporizhzhia standoff, the October intelligence that Biden could not fully explain at a fundraiser. When the people inside the machine were genuinely uncertain whether it would hold. And the machine required, as it always has, individual human beings to make the right call in conditions of extreme uncertainty. The theory is elegant. The reality is not. The theory assumes two rational actors with full information making optimal decisions. The reality is presidents at fundraisers saying the quiet part loud, and intelligence analysts working probability distributions on scenarios that have no good exits, and a nuclear power plant in a war zone being used as a military base. In Part 3, we will ask whether the machine can hold under even more complex conditions. Not 2 players, not 1 war, but 9 nuclear powers, multiple overlapping rivalries, and a world that does not yet have the communication infrastructure or the shared strategic culture to manage what it has built. The Ukrainian experiment told us MAD can hold under pressure from one nuclear power, making bad faith threats. It told us nothing about what happens when the pressure comes from all directions at once.